How should Christians approach movies? And what is the current state of faith-based films? We discuss all this and more on this week's episode of the Faith and Pop Culture Podcast with special guest Eli Price from the Establishing Shot podcast.
Hey, well, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Faith and Pop Culture Podcast. It is me, your host, Daniel, and I am joined at the desk, as I always am, by the cheap toy to buy McDonald's Happy Meal, Mr. Samuel David Camp.
I don't know why they don't just discontinue those toys because, they last. I saw a Brian Regan clip recently. It was it lasts for all of one play and then you throw it away.
Oh, but it's a glorious play when you're 6. Oh, those were the bomb. That was the highlight of my whole week. But wait, there is more. Because it is not just our two handsome faces today, but today we are a trinity of handsome, good-looking, well-spoken young gentlemen.
Don't stop there, Daniel. Keep going.
Because we are very excited today to be joined by a special guest, Mr. Eli Price, who is the host of the very great podcast, The Establishing Shot, as well as just being an overall good dude. Welcome, Eli. Thanks for joining the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been good to be on. I always think it would be a funny joke to just start inserting myself before being introduced on someone else's podcast, but I refrained from that. So.
Yeah, well, we want to make sure we give you all the honor and reverence before to introduce you. But like I said, you are the host of a great podcast, which we have both been on.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe this is your chance to just quash some of the rumors and give the truth that it seems like the general consensus is that the Jaws episode of your podcast seems to be the highest ranked, and some are calling it the classic episode. I don't know if you want to just affirm that officially.
Yeah, it's definitely connected to probably the most loved movie that y'all have been on, just in film history. So I'll leave it objectively as that, connected to the most well-known and loved movie, I guess.
It's not so much that Daniel was, it's just that he happened to be on the best episode.
The stars aligned.
It wasn't necessarily that because he was on, it was the best episode.
Yeah, y'all are on back-to-back episodes, Jaws and then Close Encounters.
Oh,
so that's the true test. People can go listen to those back-to-back.
And see that the viewership and listenership just nosedive after my episode. Wait a minute, Sam's on here. But we're excited to have you on because you're a Christian, but you're also someone that you're a cinephile. You love movies. You're more well versed, knowledgeable than I think either of us are as far as the technical stuff for movies. So I want to get you on and just chat a bit about movies, just the things we love about films, but also again, this is the Faith and Pop Culture Podcast. So just as Christians, how can we approach movies at a deeper level? But before we kind of get into some of that, why don't you share just a little bit, because you do have a unique podcast, a real fun podcast, not just when we're on, but even when we're not on, it's a great podcast. So why don't you just share briefly sort of what is the Establishing Shot podcast?
Yeah, so it is my pitch that I open every episode is that we are a podcast that does deep dives into directors and their filmographies. And they are deep dive episodes. They're long, and we get into the production, the backstory behind the movie. We delve into themes and characters and what the movie means to us personally and for the culture and for the director. That's basically what I do with the podcast. I try to get on different and fun guests to kind of talk through those with me. And I'm on my third director right now. I'm going through the filmography of Steven Spielberg, which is a big filmography. And so
that's an undertaking for sure.
Yeah. I've also I started with Wes Anderson, and then I did Christopher Nolan, two pretty different. All three filmmakers have been pretty different so far, so that's been fun. But yeah, I'm about, I think, a third-ish of the way through Spielberg's career. So yeah, it's been fun going through his movies. It's an excuse for me to fill in blind spots in filmographies. So that's fun too. But yeah, The goal is really just it kind of the idea started with I had started watching through directors' filmographies chronologically myself, just randomly, and with some other podcasts that do similar things that I listen to, and I just loved doing that. And I was like, man, I would love to. And I had wanted to do some sort of podcast related to film, so I was like, why not just marry those two things? I really love this endeavor of watching like chronologically through a director's films, and I want to talk to other people about it, and maybe other people want to listen. So,
Well, and it's interesting because it gives you a different perspective, I think, because I know I'm, especially with music, against the grain. Like in this day of singles, you just listen to this one song. Like I
Yeah.
listen to music the way you watch movies for your podcast. I'm currently working through my Italian power metal Rhapsody of Fire, and I start from the beginning back in like 1997 or whenever they started, and I listen through their discography, and then I find a new band, I
Yeah.
listen to all their, and just I feel like you get different perspectives on the growth of the music and sort of how things come together, and that's what I like about your podcast. And we're going to get into some of that too, because I think that's an approach to film that I think a lot of people, Christian or otherwise, don't necessarily always do. Like we tend to focus on the more in isolation and not kind of go as deep with this more, hey, do I like it? Do I not like it? Is there good stuff in it? Is there bad stuff to avoid? And kind of end the conversation there. And I think we miss some of the meat, the goodness that we can get if we dig a little bit deeper. But before we get into some of those questions as far as that Christian approach, I thought we could just chat a little bit about movies. 'Cause I know you love movies, we love movies. Hopefully those that are tuning into the podcast love movies, and kind of just get your perspective on stuff. Some big sweeping questions that we expect very definitive answers for. Sam challenged me before we started recording on, I was going to ask you, the best movie of all time. And
Yeah.
Sam pushed back on that, said, subjective, maybe there's not a best movie. So I amended it slightly, and I will, kind of our first question is what is the greatest movie of all time? Maybe those are synonymous, but I think there's a little bit different. But sort of in your own, as someone that's watched a lot of movies, what would you say is like the greatest movie? If you had to show one person one movie in their whole life, this would be the...
Yeah, I really like. There's not really there's no such thing in actuality.
Amen. Thank you.
It's
Eli.
just the thing with film, and if we talk more about directors too, it's kind of the same thing. As like they're all just like all filmmakers do is just kind of steal ideas that someone else did and mush in some of their own ideas, and it becomes like there's not like one that you can trace everything back to, and it's like all the great ideas come from this movie, and so it's just so hard.
Well, do you have do you have like a what's maybe your favorite currently?
Yeah, that's hard too. So like so one that we might talk more about as we like delve into faith in film specifically, that I have always loved since I first saw it was in The Tree of Life by Terrence Malick.
Okay.
I just think is like it's so essentially a film, and I guess what I mean by that is you couldn't have that as an art, like as a piece of art in any other form. Like it couldn't
only
be a
worked.
stage play.
Yeah.
It couldn't be, in the theater. It couldn't be on a painting. Like it's essentially like the through the medium of film, and that's something that like I would say like The Tree of Life or like Stalker by Andrei Tarkovsky, and directors like those are very visual filmmakers. They kind of the visual poetry of it all, and so I guess like thinking. Those are like one of those is like 60s and one of those is Tree of Life is like 2010, I think. And so very different time periods, but kind of encapsulating, I guess, the same idea of these are like such essentially film pieces of art, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, especially Tree of Life, like you feel like this is a work of art, even if you maybe don't connect with it or not. Like,
Yeah, sure.
this isn't just entertainment. This isn't this sort of diverting popcorn. Like, like I actually studied that film in like a PhD level aesthetics class, and I had to read. There's so much depth to it that we spent like hours just sort of diving into that. So good answer, although wrong, because the correct answer is Jaws is the greatest movie of all time. What about just directors? Again, maybe this is impossible to, it's like comparing Michael Jordan and Kobe and LeBron and different eras, different stuff going on. But, or maybe another way to put it, what director do you think has like the most impressive body of work that
Yeah, I mean, impressive body of work. There's a few that have a really impressive body of. I mean, Spielberg that I'm going through is one.
I feel like he's sort of. I feel like he's almost made all the movies. When you start looking at all the movies that he's directed, it's like
he's kind of like the Beatles. You know,
he's kind of done
You're like,
everything.
oh, who does that song? It's the Beatles, of course, and it's kind of like that with Spielberg.
and all the genres too. That's the
yeah.
thing that he doesn't get credit
Yeah.
for. Is like he's shown in like however many years he's been making movies, like he can make a good any kind of movie.
Sure.
He's made musicals, he's made horror, he's made action, he's made historical. Like
And even one comedy
Yeah.
that I have not seen.
But even Spielberg, he's, I've seen an interview where he was like, all the people in this generation that came up with me and generations after, like, look at me and they're like, he's such a great, filmmaker and iconic and so important. And he's like, but really, I'm just like gleaning off of all the filmmakers that came before me. And so, yeah, I mean, you have guys like Cindy Lumet, who has a really impressive body of work, a bit older. I'm trying to think. William Wyler is probably the most like Oscar decorated filmmaker of all time, with his movies like The Best Years of Our Lives and kind of considered masterpieces like that. So there's some really good ones. Alfred Hitchcock, of course, has a huge body of work.
Well, and you see with Hitchcock, you see how so many other films since Hitchcock have. Oh, you're just like doing a Hitchcock thing, like with certain cuts or the way that you set up a scene.
See, this is my confession hour. I don't think I've ever seen a Hitchcock film.
Oh man,
Like I'm familiar with, but I don't think I've ever just sat down and watched.
Yeah.
I feel like
I think a lot of people kind of think immediately of the movie Psycho, and they're like, oh, Alfred Hitchcock is horror, I don't want to watch him. But really, most of his movies are like kind of mystery thrillers.
Thrillers.
Yeah, they're more like focused on like mystery, and they're really like, a lot of them are really like fun and exciting, and in a similar way that like a lot of Spielberg movies are, for instance. Like they're kind of like, ooh, what's going to happen? Who's the one that did it? Kind of things. And,
yeah.
And he's great for a good quote. Like I haven't watched Hitchcock movies, but like I've read a lot of his. Like if you just want to like hear someone talk and like educate this peon about film, listen to Hitchcock. Maybe to shift a little bit, and you might have actually already answered this in a previous question, but what would you say sort of the greatest or like most interesting as far as like faith, spiritual, like not necessarily faith based in like the modern sense, but just a movie that this is a movie that you can has a spiritual sense to it, or it's about faith, or what would be your favorite that you think is like the most well done?
Yeah. So again, I didn't write one answer when I was thinking of this, but to give like a few. So last year I watched for the first time The Passion of Joan of Arc, which is like a 20s, I believe, movie, and it's really like incredible. And it's one that like when I watched it, I was like, man, like every Christian needs to watch this movie. Just because it's so it's so like steeped in, I guess, faith and what it means to die for your faith and to hold on to your faith and all of that. And on top of that, like she's a woman, and so there's that like added element on top of it of like her being oppressed in that way, on top of like the faith that she has. And so it's just really interesting as far as an old film. Other ones, I mentioned The Tree of Life, I think is incredible as far as like exploring faith, a lot of that movie is centered around, I think the language that they use in some of the narration is like the way of nature and the way of grace. And that's really cool, and interesting. I think Martin Scorsese, a lot of his films deal with, he's a Roman Catholic. And so he kind of like, a lot of his movies are kind of steeped in that kind of Roman Catholic guilt, that stereotypical Roman Catholic guilt. But he adapted a Japanese novel called Silence that I think is an incredible exploration of like faith and doubt, and how faith plays out in different cultures. I think it's an incredible movie as far as like exploring faith and through the art form of film. So
I know that's the one that usually, like, when this question gets asked out there on the internet, like it's always, if it's not at the top, it's always like
Top
in the
5.
top couple
Yeah.
of like,
Which I have not seen that one, but it's on on my list too.
I will say this.
I'm sure it's rough.
really a rough watch.
Yeah.
So like if
I got that impression.
Yeah, the book is incredible too. I highly recommend reading the book. It's translated from Japanese to English, a good translation, and it's really good, and it helps that Scorsese is like one of my favorite personal directors. So yeah.
Well, and I heard that he's actually doing a whole series on the Saints for, I think, Fox. I think it's coming out.
I didn't know that.
At the end of the year. Like he's going through like the life of.
well, he's sort of in his like I know he's always done spiritual. He's always been from that background, but because I know he's also making like a movie on Jesus, like the life of Jesus, and like it seems like he's like sort of at the end of his life. He's almost like moved some of his spiritual stuff even more to the front of like, I think he's even said, and I don't have that many movies left of me. I want to tell these stories about, things that are very important to me. But it's kind of interesting because I think we think of like faith-based stuff, and I think what comes to mind, at least for a lot of people today, is sort of the more like churchy, Bible study-esque type films. Like kind of, when we started calling movies faith-based and not just sort of like, movies that had spiritual stuff or things in it.
I will say I'm a little disappointed that Eli didn't mention Chariots of Fire
That's a terrible blind spot that I have.
Have you not seen Chariots of Fire?
I have not.
Oh.
If we knew that, we wouldn't have invited him.
Well, this changes everything.
We need to update our vetting process. And hey, I haven't seen Hitchcock, so I guess I'll let other people not see.
I haven't seen Tree of Life, so
say, hey, you can't watch all the movies. But I thought before we shift into just some questions about like how do we engage film at a deeper level, I thought I'd get your take while we have you on here, as far as just like, because people, it's been said, I think I've even said it in reviews and stuff, that we're sort of in like this golden age of like faith-based content, and like I tend to use that in the sense of like there's a lot of it, like almost like it's not like when Mel Gibson's The Passion came and it's like every Christian in America had to go see it because we hadn't had anything like that in theaters ever, which isn't true, but that was the the perception. Where now it's like reviewing movies, it's like every 2-3 weeks there's a new faith-based sports drama, faith-based this, or this story about this Christian saint, and there's a bunch of studios that are all making these movies, and I do think the quality is significantly higher, just like technically, than it was 10 years ago. What's kind of your take on that? As someone that's seen a lot of films, maybe some of the faith-based stuff, or not faith, the more Christian stuff, outside of the genre, like what do you see as sort of the current era? Like, does any of the new stuff interest you, or is it? What's sort of your take on that?
I tend not to watch them. They kind of frustrate me, if that makes sense. So I tend I tend not to watch them unless like someone I trust like highly recommends like, oh, this one you should see, sort of thing. It's so like I've heard recently, I don't know if people are familiar with like exploitation films. So exploitation films, it sounds bad, but it's not inherently a bad, like a bad thing for a film to be considered an exploitation film. All it means is that like it's made by a specific group, like kind of for a specific group. So in like the 60s and 70s, there was like a movement of blacks. It was called the blaxploitation films, and it was movies, kind of low budget genre films made by black filmmakers for a black audience in general. And it wasn't necessarily, a lot of those movies are like revered. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I've heard this kind of recent movement in faith-based films called Christploitation. And it's kind of, and I don't know, I feel like it wouldn't have to be a bad thing, but I feel like it's just strange to me that Christians have decided, let's create a financial market where we can make movies to sell to only Christians. If that makes sense, because that's kind of the idea of like an exploitation film is we're going to make these films for a specific audience, and they're going to be like hyper targeted toward that audience so that we can, make some money off of those people. I think that the movies, a lot of these faith-based films feel like they now have they're still like B movies, like low budget movies as far as like the content goes. But like now like you were saying, they look really good now. So they like feel like A-list movies when you watch them, because just the technology has advanced and it's, everyone has access to better technology now, but the content still feels like B movies. Like the dialogue is weird, and like it, yeah. So I don't know. There's very few in recent history that I've like actually watched and thought, oh, that was pretty good. Like the Case for Christ movie comes to mind. I thought that was actually pretty well done. I don't know if y'all saw that, but
I didn't see that.
I didn't. But I know my wife, who again isn't always crazy about those types of films. I remember her saying, like, you know what, it wasn't terrible. It was good.
Exactly, yeah.
And there is a sense too that and as someone that now like reviews movies, I don't know, it just rubs me a bit wrong that because there is this tension of like, hey, support things that are sort of the values, and like, because the message is so like intertwined with these movies, it can be, it can be tricky to like, okay, I don't like the film, I like the message, I want people to hear that message. I don't know if I want people to hear that message through this quality of film, and to criticize the movie, am I criticizing the message? And some of that can just be tricky. Do you think some of the reason why the films maybe haven't broken out more, not just like more mainstream, but just presented themselves more at the level of just the average or a good film? Do you think some of that comes from just a diminished value that Christians place on movies, that we've embraced movies because we can see that they're effective vehicles for change and all that, and we've latched on to like the more pragmatic sense, but maybe that like the love for film as a medium, the love for film as an art form, maybe that sort of has lagged behind a bit, and that there aren't as many Christians doing like you do on your podcast, of just appreciating this film for what it is and going deeper levels beyond just it's a tool to communicate from the creator to the audience. And kind of in related to that, like, why would you say Christians should watch films? Like, is there value in Christians sitting down watching a movie, even one that's maybe not like preaching to the choir right to them, or is it more just like it's kind of junk food and it's okay to nibble on it now and then, but Christians really should be focused more on deeper, more theological matters?
Yeah, I think so. So to kind of like springboard off of like those are all kind of like interconnected, those questions. And I think Christians do a lot of times, and it's almost like, especially like maybe the Christians that are like financially backing the movies really want to press that message into it. It's almost like the Christian studios aren't that much better than like Hollywood studios that try to like force messages into movies, maybe. And so it's kind of like, well, we're doing the very thing with our movies that we don't like that Hollywood does with their movies. Can't the art just be the art? And can't we just like tell good stories and make them like look good? And so that's probably part of the problem, but it could be solved by Christians being more well versed in like film history and film, just like watching more films to like take in the art and see what ideas are out there. But as far as like why Christians should watch film, I really just think it's because they're creations like by other human beings. We're part of being made in the image of God is, God is a creator and he made us to be creators too. And so that looks different for different people. Art is what we usually think of when we think of like creators. But I mean, starting a business and creating like a productive business is being a creator too. So, that applies in a lot of different ways, but specifically for the art, like the arts, I think just enjoying, even if it is just like escapism, an escapism movie, like a big fun blockbuster movie that you go to see, it's a work of creation that's like exciting and engaging. And we wouldn't say that like going out and watching like a meteor shower is like just junk food, just because it doesn't necessarily like, it's just like, oh, it's just something that God created that looks cool, because that's what it is. And so why would we say that about like something that someone created that's just fun and looks cool? It's a creation. And so I think we can just enjoy movies because they're things that humans have created, and that's what God wants us to be doing is to be creating. And so,
I know, like, and you're probably familiar with it too. Like, I know, like Tolstoy, like the Russian novelist, like, kind of his definition of like great art is like it's that which like brings people together. And there you can finagle a little bit with that definition. Maybe some more nuance is needed, but I think that general idea that I think that's what art is. Like, art in whatever form it is connects us. Like, it's something that we have in common. It's stories told by people that we can experience in like a communal setting with other people. And even movies that aren't necessarily just super deep with themes and this is going to change me forever, I'll never be the same when I walk into the theater, even if it is just like, hey, give me another popcorn and some some M&Ms and watch the superhero with a cape beat the bad guy with the spandex. Like, even at that level, there is a sense that it's sort of this communal thing that like a bunch of people were involved making this and communicating it, and we're experiencing that like with other people. And I think you're right. I think like as Christians, like there's value in that connectivity and that like just sort of experiencing someone else's expression of their humanity, that I think they're beyond just sort of being fun diversion. Like, I think there's like edifying value in that.
Yeah.
As far as sort of like, again, because I think one of the things I like about with your podcast is, like I mentioned earlier, like you go deep. Like you go, like I think our Jaws episode, we were, like almost 3 hours. We had a long episode, and we barely, like I think listening back, I don't even think we ended up talking about the music, which is crazy because it's like the most iconic. There's just so much to get into with these movies. I know, again, I don't want to speak for all Christians. I know there are a lot of Christians like you that are engaging at a deeper level, but I think in general, within the church, I don't know if a lot of Christians always go that extra mile. Not that everyone needs to, start a podcast on it and go that deep, but just watching movies beyond the level of, just does it have violence and sex and swearing? Yes, no. Like, does it have a theme about Jesus, or is it, does it not? And like kind of stopping the conversation there. How do you think the church can do better, or just like Christians can do better to equip themselves or to equip each other to engage, on a more thoughtful way? Like what are some maybe like general principles that you keep in mind yourself as you sit down to watch a film you've never seen before, and just, balancing, like, I want to enjoy this. It is a film, but I also want to, be thoughtful about how I watch this.
Yeah. So I think one of the beautiful things about movies, and really just like art in general, but I think because films are like taking so many different senses, like they're tapping into so many different, like your sight, your sound, like even like if you're in a theater, sometimes like you can feel, the sound, and it's tapping into all that. And I think what happens with art and film in particular is you go into it and you kind of let your defenses down, if that makes sense. So, it's, if you were to having a conversation with someone, they were like, so how about like your relationship with your parents? You like put walls up, and you like maybe don't let them get into like the deepest roots of maybe an issue maybe you have with your parents, or even like the opposite of that, or like how much you love your parents. Like you kind of like put relational walls up. But with art, and what I love about film is when you go into those movies, you're like watching a story, and like you forget to put your defenses up usually. And so like you'll find yourself like tearing up over, this scene between a father and son or whatever. And so what's happening there is, oh, it's tapped into something about you, that you normally would have your defenses, like your emotional defenses up for, but you forgot to put those up. So what is it that's making you sad about that scene? Or what is it that's making you like tearfully joyful watching that scene? Or like, what is it that makes you laugh at this joke? It's all those emotions. And what I like to like teach people to do is like to like store those away, like so that you can think about them after the movie. Why did I cry at that scene? What was it tapping into about myself? So I think one of the things people can do, I like to explain it as like movies are mirrors in a way. So they kind of show you something about yourself, whether they're faith-based or not, it doesn't really matter, because it's still a human that has human relationships creating stories about, human problems. And so movies can really like show you something about yourself. And then they act in a second way as mirrors, because they show you something about either the filmmaker or like the culture or society that the film was made out of. And so it can help you like learn something about what is my culture value that I live in, or what makes Japanese culture different than my culture if you're watching a Japanese film, those sorts of things. So thinking about movies as mirrors in those two ways, what is it teaching me about myself, and what is it teaching me about the culture? What is it reflecting about, the culture that it comes out of? I think those are like two helpful things to like keep in the back of your mind while you watch movies, as you're just like enjoying it for what it is, of course, but also like keeping those things and like logging those as you watch, like, oh, that was interesting, let me think about that more later. I think that's like a very simple way to like more thoughtfully and deeply engage in movies.
Yeah, which I find myself doing all the time, like reviewing movies. Like I'm in the theater, and then like a thing will happen. It's like, okay, I don't want to just spend the next, 5 scenes pondering that. So I try and store it. Sometimes I'll actually take notes, like in a theater, of like, okay, I need to think about that. But I think it's fascinating, the first thing you said, because I do think there is a segment of Christians in the church that just don't think critically at all about films. It's just, tell me if it has junk in it, and if not, it's good. But I think the ones that do seek to engage at a more thoughtful level, I think the aspect that is missing in some of that is what you're saying, of the emotional part. Like I think a lot of like the engagement within the last couple of years as far as entertainment and stuff has been at a very like head level of just almost homework. Like it's just, you're sitting there, almost like you're in a college classroom, and you're like dissecting the worldview and the messages and things, and almost like you sort of set aside any of the emotional part of film, and you just take it as like a, what is this filmmaker telling me? You're preaching, what's his sort of lecture, and do I agree with that? And I think there's value in still having those conversations, but
Right. Yeah.
But in some ways, it's missing what films are. Like the reason films are powerful and like effective and beloved is because they do move us at like a deeper emotional heart level, and and that's an important part of processing that film and like the experience. That I think if as Christians, if we become too sort of like intellectual about the movie, and to the point that we don't actually just accept the film that it is, then I think we're also missing a significant part of like just films in general. One more question for you that I thought was interesting. 'Cause one of the things a third thing. See, I like many things about your podcast. One more thing I like about your podcast is that you do. Like you said, you cover a filmmaker's entire like filmography. You go through movie by movie, I think chronologically, and I think that does give a different perspective, because I think most people we might watch a film of a director not chronologically. Maybe we haven't seen any of the other films. This is the new one. We don't always go back. What do you think is the value? Again, you can't do that every time you watch a movie, but what is the value of some of that, of just kind of placing like a film, like a work of of art, in the context of a creator's like wider kind of canon body of work?
Yeah. So when what's funny is when I was thinking about when you sent me like some of the things we'd be talking about, and I saw this in the notes, I was like, oh, I need to go. I've done kind of a breakout session at conferences where I teach about movies and faith, and there's this Francis Schaeffer quote from it's a little book called Art in the Bible that I highly recommend. You can read it like super quick. It's real small, where he talks about this, and you happen to have it like in the notes right below, and I was like, oh yeah. And it's basically just this idea that the totality of an artist's work kind of shows their worldview as a whole. And I think even more than that, even more than the Schaeffer quote, it kind of shows you how it can even show you like how they mature, how their thoughts change, how maybe things going on in history kind of affect the direction of their art. And I was thinking too about like, if you were to say like, well, what was Van Gogh like as an artist? You wouldn't say, well, here's his like most famous painting. Can you just look at that and you can kind of figure out what kind of like artist Van Gogh was. It's like, well, no, you kind of have to like look at all of his paintings and look at his work and kind of even maybe learn a little bit about his life. And I think people don't think about that with film directors as like filmmakers as artists, but I think it's a similar thing. Like when I in my podcast, what I really love is I usually am reading like a biography or something of the director kind of as I work through their filmography, and you can kind of see how things that you see in the movies like reflect maybe what's going on in their life at the time, or even like important historical things that are happening at the time that are like reflected in the movie. And I think that's really interesting too. So yeah, I do think it's important it's important to do in the same way that like when you learn about history and like art and history, you don't just like say, well, this is the statue of David, that tells you everything you need to know about Michelangelo. It's like, well, no, he has an entire body of work that says all kinds of stuff about him and what was going on in his culture. And so I would say that same thing applies to like directors and filmmakers in general.
Yeah, because I know, there's days where I feel sad and discouraged, or I'm grieving about something, and there's days where, it's a real great day, and I had a great day with my kids, and it's, I feel a lot of joy, and I feel like it's okay for me to like dwell in one, process the grief, and then, at other times I process joy or other experiences, and, that it's okay to not have to, have all our emotions, all our thoughts, kind of lay them all out on the table every single time. Because in some ways, I'll even take Schaefer's quote further to, I think it's important to approach films like, in the body of the individual filmmaker's work, body of work, but also just like as a canon of film, like, that this film, because there was I believe it was for the Joker movie, which came out a couple of years ago. And I want a Christian, kind of prominent Christian speaker guy did a review. He hadn't seen the movie yet, but the reason he had said he didn't, in his article, kind of wrote an article on it, is that there was just a lack of hope, like that it just dwelt in a lot of despair and disillusionment and disenfranchisement, all this sort of these emotions. And kind of his take was, but it's an incomplete film because it doesn't also have the hope. It doesn't kind of combine both of those. And at least to me, again, people can have different opinions on that, but I feel like it doesn't need that though. Like, there are films that have that. There are films that have both, that, a character moves from one stage to the other. But I feel like there's also value in just processing in, specific themes or emotions and stuff in a film, and not expecting that every film like represents the totality of who this person is or who humanity is, and that we have to cover.
Yeah.
And I know, like we've talked, Sam, like with one of the downfalls or the tendencies that we don't like for like a lot of faith-based films is that like you got all of it in there. Like you got, it's even if it has a message, it has like 10 messages, and it wants to cover this and this teaching point and this emotion and this tragedy and this, and it's just almost like there's a sense that like every filmmaker makes a film, like every sort of these faith-based filmmakers, as though like this is the last film they will ever get to make, or any Christian will get to make, and they got to make sure like every audience member gets that.
Well, and I think the danger in that obviously is that you end up not telling a good story because you're trying to do weight, like you're putting way too much weight on a single film. And I think there is just sort of this, at least within faith-based film, a real kind of fear that of loose ends and fear of ambiguity and fear of untidy endings, which I love an untidy ending in a movie. I think that's one of the great things about some movies is you didn't get, there was no resolve necessarily. And I think sometimes that's okay. But it's like at least the faith-based film community, I don't think has yet really learned to be okay with that. And I don't know if that's going back to like what you're saying, like there's sort of this two sides to it, because you've got all the funding aspect wants there to be a tidy summation at the end and like no loose ends, and it's very, very clear the message of the film. And I wonder just, what is that? I would love to know those conversations among like people who are working on these films. Like, is there a lot of pushback from the producers or what is that like? And why are we so afraid of having films that maybe have a little more ambiguity or don't end with a conversion at the end? Like, why not just like leave some stuff unprocessed and leave it up to the audience to process? I don't know.
Because there is sort of a cliche of like people, and I used to do that too, of like Christian filmmakers and sort of, they're just bad. Like they don't know how to tell nuanced stories. And as I've like had at least slightly more exposure and like conversations with screenwriters and people, like, and even like being in the room for some of those conversations, like you begin to realize like, no, like there's a lot of other factors at play.
Yeah.
That this isn't necessarily even the story they want to tell. It's the story that they need to tell if they want this movie to have the money to to be able to market it to this specific audience. I know there's probably a million other questions, unless you had another one that you wanted to lob at Eli.
Well, maybe if you could just touch on a little bit your what you lead like a small group, or you did lead a small group, and in your church. Maybe just tell folks a little bit about that, because I think it's a really practical way or entry point perhaps for churches to maybe be able to engage a little more with film. Maybe just a quick overview of what that was like.
Yeah, so I did lead a small group for one semester at our church, and I plan to do it again in the future. But I just called it Faith in Film, and what I actually did with it was I started with like more towards the beginning of film history, and I think we ended up doing like 8 or 9 weeks that we met, and each week we had a different film, and we kind of worked our way up through film history, and we talked a little bit about every time we met, we would talk kind of about, I would do some research about like the filmmaker and how the movie, like the backstory behind the movie. And then we would just kind of talk about like the visual and like story themes, and like then we would talk about it for what was there first, because I think that's important. And then we would kind of talk about, okay, so what does this mean? How does this relate to our faith? Like what does this tell us? And so I know like at one point we watched 2001: A Space Odyssey. And
real approachable stuff.
Yeah, it's not a faith film, but it can tell you a lot about humanity and what does like why is humanity so interested in progress, and it tells you a lot of things about humanity that faith kind of speaks to and can come into dialogue with. And if people do want like a resource to think more about film, like to be able to think better about film, I would recommend Real Spirituality by Robert K. Johnson. It's REEL, Spirituality.
I see what he did.
Very, very clever pun. But he talks about coming into theological dialogue with a movie. And so and kind of what he means by that is you come at it and you let the movie say what it's trying to say. You don't try to like read Christian themes into it. You just kind of, it's like the difference if you want to do Bible talk, it's the difference between exegesis and eisegesis. So eisegesis is reading into scripture something that you wanted to say. Exegesis is reading what it actually says in its context, like reading it for that. And he kind of talks about a similar thing with movies. Let them say what they're going to say, and then say, okay, so how do I respond to that? If it's very like humanistic, kind of like 2001 is, how does my faith speak to that? Does it answer questions that the movie has that the movie doesn't maybe have good answers for? And why is that? So, and we kind of use some of those concepts when we would like discuss the films that we watched in that small group. So yeah, I would recommend grabbing a book like that, learning a little bit more about how to engage with film, and then just start a small group and watch a movie, or start a little movie club with your friends, watch movies and then talk about them and what they mean, and why you cried at that one scene. I would highly recommend that for sure.
Well, I think there's this thing edifying about that experience together, and I love hearing groups. I got a message before with our collision stuff that from like someone in the UK that had a group at his church. And they go out to see movies in the theater together, and then they come back and discuss it. And that's even what I enjoy with like doing the collision, like the reviews, is that like, I can watch the movie, share my thoughts, but then like I love like the comments we get and like being able to engage in some of those. And like people make comments and stuff like, brilliant point, Daniel, couldn't agree more. But then they also make comments on things, like bringing up points and themes that like, hey, I just didn't even see that in the movie. I didn't, maybe like my own, biases and stuff, like, or just like as a guy, I wouldn't see some things that maybe like a female would see in the movie, or, whatever it might be, or someone that came from a Christian background as opposed to someone that, a new Christian, or, some struggles. And I feel like a lot of the stuff that you can get out of a movie that is edifying, like you're saying, can come when you're doing it like in a more collective body. But speaking of something that is, I have no doubt will be very edifying to me, to Sam, to everyone else on this earth, is the next segment of this podcast. We have things we like that you should like too. So because we have a special guest today, me and Sam get the week off from sharing things we like. Sorry, we will deprive you from 1 week, leave you on your toes for what we will share next.
Don't worry, I've got a backlog. Prepped and ready.
But because we have you here, Eli, why don't you just share, anything you want so that you like, that you think, hey, maybe other people could or should like as well.
Yeah, so I am going to share another resource that I use. I believe I've told you guys about it, and it's becoming more and more popular. And it's a little app called LetterBoxd. I'm probably on it too much, kind of like looking at what movies people are watching and that sort of thing. But it's kind of like a little social media for like film watchers, I guess is how you would describe it. And it has all kinds of ways you can use it. You can just use it to like look up movies and who's in them and who made them and that sort of thing. Sort of some information that would be on like IMDb or whatever. You can see all that for the movie, but also you can follow people and you can like log reviews. It has like a diary where you can log, I watched this movie on this date. You can maybe write a quick or a long review if you want, and that sort of thing. And you can see other people's too that you follow. You can comment on their review, that sort of thing. And you can also make like lists. So you can make like my favorite Spielberg films list and rank them, which I really enjoy that sort of thing, is like making ranked lists. It's kind of fun for me. I don't know why, but and you can do that, but you can also make like, oh, here's like one I made recently was a list of films that I thought were really good at like visual storytelling. So that like if anyone's ever asking about like visual storytelling, I'm like, oh, I made this list. These are films I think that do a good job at that. So it's just a fun, you follow people, they follow you, and people have some interesting reviews on there. It's fun to kind of like see, if I follow some friends on there, and so it's fun to see like, oh, this friend hated this movie and this friend loved this movie, and then, usually I'm in a text group with some of those guys and I'll like text them and be like, I can't believe you hated this movie. It was so good, So that's kind of my recommendation. What it did for me, if you're like, that's totally uninteresting for me. I do love movies, but don't want to be on another social media. If you wanted to just be like a personal thing, you don't have to follow people on it. What it helped me with was back when I was really getting into movies, I had decided that for 1 year I was going to write something, just whether it was just a small paragraph or like a long something about every movie I watched. And so I did that for a year, and I haven't stopped for like several years now. And but what that did is it helped me learn how to like process my thoughts on a movie and what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, that sort of thing. And so even if just for that, I'd recommend getting it, because it's a very like organized way to do that. If you're okay with like using technology instead of like a pen and paper. So that's my recommendation. LetterBoxd. It's spelled letter and then BOXD. No ED. So, and it's everywhere. They're on the red carpets now, the people that make LetterBoxd, interviewing directors and actors, and so it's getting pretty big.
Yeah, I think I saw David Fincher commenting about it in an interview the other day, and he seemed like he was a fan.
Yeah, well, it's fun because you actually had messaged, you say, hey, you guys need to get on there, and then I had like I think 2 other people in like a couple weeks span say, hey, you guys on LetterBoxd? Like, do you? So actually, we have a collision one. We haven't shared it yet.
Okay.
I'm still working to get some of the backlog of movies and and figuring out kind of how.
I'll have like an indie film corner on there.
I'll make my list of best movies of all time, and it'll be a list of one, and it'll just have Jaws. So I haven't.
People do funny lists like that. Like they'll do like a list that's like ultra specific, like dads that take like that take their, like there was one with Trap, the new M. Night movie Trap, and like something where it was like very specifically like a dad taking his daughter to something, and then something goes like terribly wrong, and it was like 2 movies that it applied to in the list.
Yeah.
But it is fun. I think it is a way, again, because you can choose how much you engage or you don't engage with other people. But if you don't necessarily have your own community of people to talk about films, or just to see how other people process films. Like I know reading I try not to read reviews before I do my own review, but I will after sometimes, just to I want to see how other people watch and what they get out of movies as a way to sort of help me learn to think deeper. Well, we're glad that you have joined us, Eli. It was fun. I know we've been wanting to have you on this podcast for a while, and we'll definitely will be dragging you back on at some point again in the not too distant future. But why don't you just share a little bit, like, hey, where can people, if they want to, check out your podcast or just engage with you or pepper you with other hard questions about film, where can they find you?
Yeah, I would say probably for me personally, I guess would be Twitter. My handle is just the Eli Price, so TheEliPrice. And then you can also find the podcast. I guess the centralized location would be establishingshotpod.com, and you can find like all the socials, and you can also just search the Establishing Shot and find it on like all the podcast platforms and YouTube. So yeah, but if you go to establishingshotpod.com, you can find all of that stuff, links to all of that stuff. So yeah, I would love for people to follow, go listen to the show. Let me know what you think. Hit me up on Twitter or Instagram or whatever. And one of the fun things we do is we'll do like movie drafts. Like I think me and Daniel did a creature feature movie draft, and people got the next like Monday, people got to like vote on whose draft was the best. And so you can see like all those on Instagram.
And I won't spoil who won that. I'll just say I'm still basking in the glow of those results. But Curtis, I think, especially people say that the Jaws episode is particularly enlightening. So go check that out. But we are excited and glad that you have joined us, Eli. I'm glad that all the rest of you have joined us too and tuned in for this conversation. And we hope we will see you next week, every Thursday, for more conversations on faith and pop culture.